Okay, little known fact about me. I love to fish. Now, what I didn't just say is I'm good at fishing. I love to fish, but I'm not actually very good at it. You see, most of the time when I go fishing, I come back with zero catches, like no fish at all. So when I've talked to friends who are much more knowledgeable than I am about fishing, about why I can never catch fish, they usually tell me kind of two things. They say essentially that, first of all, I have to get a clear sense of like what fish I'm going for. That helps determine what sort of bait you use and when you fish and things like that, right? But the second thing they say is you also really have to know where to find fish. And that's a massive problem. I usually just like throw my, bait into the water in random spots and hope for the best. Okay, why am I talking about fishing? Well, of course, because it's an elaborate metaphor to set up the fact that this video is about finding primary sources, which is not unlike trying to find fish. You see, finding primary sources is all about knowing what kinds of primary sources you want to find and where those primary sources live. So that's what we're going to talk about in this video, how to find primary sources, particularly for research projects in history. All right, let's get going. All right, so I've organized this video into three parts. We're going to start by talking a little bit about what primary sources are, do a little bit of review there, but also talking about kind of types of primary sources and thinking through primary sources via kind of categories of primary sources. Second, we're going to talk about where primary sources live. That's a really, really important component to finding primary sources. In that section, I'm also going to give you my tips on kind of finding primary sources in those places. And then finally, I'm going to end with some final tips and thoughts about the work of finding primary sources. All right, let's start by just talking about what are the types of primary sources that we might encounter in our research. All right, let's start with a reminder of what primary sources are. So I'm going to pull a quote from Mary Lynn Rampolla, who defines primary sources like this. She says, primary sources are materials produced by people or groups directly involved in the event or topic under consideration, either as participants or as witnesses. That's a great definition of primary sources. And it connects to kind of the ways that we've defined primary sources already in this class, that primary sources have to be sort of generated from the time and place that we're studying. And second, that they're based largely on experience, right? On the authority of experience. It's important, however, to go a little further in thinking about primary sources. It's one thing to just have a basic definition for what a primary source is, but we should also think about different types of primary sources or different categories of primary sources. This helps us not only find primary sources, but also think about how to use them and analyze them. This is exactly what Jenny Presnell writes in her book, The Information Literate Historian. She says that there are many ways primary sources can be categorized. Thinking of them in categories will help you search for them. So what are the types of categories of primary sources that we can sort of think through in order to search and find primary sources? Let's start first with what Anthony Brundage said in his book about primary sources. Brundage approached primary sources by thinking about the ways that we find primary sources today, right? What are the forms that primary sources take? And he really identified two main types of primary sources. The first was manuscript sources. Manuscript sources are essentially things in their original form, things that are one of a kind, a handwritten letter or a census document that was done by hand. And then Brundage says the other kind of type of primary source are published sources. These are sources that were replicated, that were reproduced in some way. Any way you do it, Brundage sort of points out that there are kind of two main forms that we can think of primary sources as primary sources in sort of a one-of-a-kind original form and primary sources in a published and replicable form. But that's not the only way to think about primary sources. We can also think about primary sources based on how they were produced, how and sort of why they were produced. And that helps us differentiate primary sources from each other. First, we can think about primary sources in the format that they take. Some primary sources are textual in nature. That means that they are documents with words and that you can read, right? But we also know that some primary sources are not textual. A clay pot, for example, that is excavated from an archaeological dig, or a painting, right? These can function as primary sources. They can tell us stuff about the past, but they don't have any text to read or interpret. Second, we can think about the intentionality of the source. Was a source sort of intended to be preserved and read by many other people, or was it not, right? Was it sort of, is it happenstance that the historian happens to have that as a relic of the past? Intentional sources are those sources that were produced in order to be preserved, right? You might think of government documents or things that were sort of done and produced so that they could be saved and used and consulted later on. Unintentional sources are things like, I don't know, the grocery list that you write down on a napkin before you head to H-E-B. If for some reason that grocery list then ends up in a folder and gets put away in a drawer, and 100 years later someone finds it, some historian finds it, and uses it as an example of, I don't know, the social history of the 21st century, well, then they found an unintentional source, a source that was produced not to be preserved in any sort of way, but produced just in the moment. Third, we might think of the audience of a primary source. Was a source produced in order to be consumed by a large public? Or was a source produced in order to be read only by a small handful of people? We might think of public items as things like newspapers, right? It gets produced so that lots of people can read it. A private primary source might be something like a letter that was only intended for really one person. Fourth, we can look at the style of the primary source. This one's a little confusing, but I'll try to explain. Some primary sources, especially textual primary sources, are created in order to be prescriptive, meaning they are created in order to kind of produce some sort of reality that doesn't already exist. I'm going to go into more detail in this later, but you might think of, for example, a law. A law is a primary source that does not really describe what's going on at the time, but instead is intended to sort of alter reality, alter what people do, right, and how people behave. Descriptive sources, on the other hand, are sources that are just intended to reflect the reality of the moment. Okay, finally, we can think of the perspective of a source. Some sources are intended to be non-fictional in nature. They are produced so that they might reflect some sort of reality or truth about what was going on at the time. But we also know that primary sources don't have to be non-fictional in nature. They can be fictional. A novel can be a primary source. But it's a primary source not because it tells us about something that actually happened in the past, but rather that it reflects some sort of cultural or social understanding of the day. So the production of primary sources is one way to think about how to categorize primary sources, right? We're going to use those as sort of the values that we put on to different types of sources to sort of identify them. Okay, now we've reviewed what primary sources are. We've thought through a little bit about what species, if you will, of primary sources exist and that you can consult for your research. Now let's talk about where do those primary sources live? How do you actually find them? Well, here it's kind of important to remember what Brundage said. Remember that we find primary sources in two basic forms, right? In manuscript form or in published form. So with that in our mind, we can now look at the three main places that we find primary sources today. First, there's archives, right? This means both physical archives and digital archives, and I'll talk a little more about that in a bit. And yes, that is me in the archive with a soul patch. Second, there is publications, right? Things like anthologies or modern editions of older works or collected works from a single author or something like that. And then finally, there are databases. And databases are really similar to archives, except that databases tend to be sort of websites that aggregate lots of different archives together. And usually they aggregate archives that are on a similar theme or a similar topic of some sort. I'll show you an example in a bit. Databases can be subscription databases that you get access through your institution, or open access databases, things that you can just go to on the internet and find along with everyone else. First, archives. I mentioned that there are two different types of archives, physical archives and digital. And we'll start with the physical archives. Physical archives are basically just places where documents and artifacts from the past are stored. They can be lots of different types of physical archives. So if you're doing history here at Baylor, you'll have access to a few different types of archives. First, there are the Baylor archives. There are a few different archives that are here housed on campus. There's the Texas Collection over in Carroll Library, the Pogue Legislative Library, the Armstrong Browning Library, which has documents on sort of 19th century literary culture in England, and a variety of others that exist throughout campus. So if you're researching any of these topics, you can go to these archives and use manuscript sources, right? Original sources from the past on these topics, things like Texas history or like congressional history. But those aren't the only physical archives that exist in Waco. There are also special collections, special archives of sort of either nonprofit organizations or independent organizations. One that we can think of is the Texas Baptist Historical Library or Historical Collection that exists here in Waco. You can go there if you're interested in the history of the Baptist Church in Texas, the Texas Baptist Convention. And then, of course, there are government archives. And government archives are usually organized around sort of political units. So, for example, we can think of the McLennan County Archives. There are the Texas State Archives, which exist all throughout Texas in various locations. Or we can think of national archives like the Library of Congress or archives associated with the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. All of these are places where documents exist, oftentimes in their original manuscript form, and you can go there and check them out. But if you can't get to Washington, D.C., you can also take advantage of digital archives. Digital archives are essentially digitization projects associated with various physical archives. For example, the Library of Congress has a massive digital collection that they have curated on lots of different topics, and you can go and sort of investigate the various topics that are all associated with the Library of Congress. And this is sort of the next best thing to actually going to the physical archive. What will happen, or what happens in digital archives is usually you'll see exact photo replicas of the original documents, the manuscript documents that are housed at these archives. So you'll get a chance to actually see the original thing, albeit in a kind of digital form. Okay, second, primary sources also show up in publications. One example of this is something that you might be familiar with from other history classes you've taken. There are these things called readers or document collections that are essentially formatted around a theme or some sort of historical topic. And usually it's a transcription and sometimes translation of primary sources all related to that topic. The benefit of primary source readers is that you know exactly what the documents are going to be about. They're going to be about the topic that is the kind of title of the primary source reader. Also, they usually include lots of kind of secondary and tertiary source information there to contextualize the documents that you're looking at. Downside, of course, is that this is a kind of highly curated form of primary sources. You don't get the full original thing. It's a little distance away from the original material. And oftentimes these are only excerpts of primary sources rather than the full texts. You can also get modern editions of full primary sources. Works of ancient authors like Cicero, for example, have modern editions through Penguin or a variety of other presses. Finally, there are selected or complete works. This is kind of like a reader, but for a specific person. So you'll get publications that have a lot of different documents, all from the same historical figure or author. And the idea there is to give you a kind of deep knowledge of what that person said or wrote about or published or is involved in. Finally, there are databases. And remember, databases are essentially websites that aggregate digital archives together. Baylor University has a bunch of subscription databases that you have access to as a Baylor student. The way to find these is really simple. First, you can just go to the History Workshop Library Guide. There will be a portal there to accessing databases through Baylor, and it's a really easy way to kind of get started with your research. But you can also do this by going kind of through the Baylor Library website. If you go to the Baylor Library website and you click on databases, and then you just click on View All Databases. I often like then to filter out the history databases. You will find that there's a list of all sorts of databases on a ton of different topics. I really, really highly recommend that you at least scan this list to see if any of these databases are relevant to the thing that you want to study and research. If so, you're going to have access to a ton of documents, all curated on that topic. And finally, there are the open access databases. These are databases that you can access through the web, right, for free. The biggest one is probably Google Books. If you're looking for some sort of published work from the past, right, whether it be 200 or 300 years old, there's a chance that you can find it on Google Books, an edition that will come as a PDF and you can download for free from the web. Another way that I like to access open access materials is by looking at the library guides of other universities. You see, professors like me will oftentimes teach classes on certain topics, and then they'll have librarians create library guides that link to all sorts of open access materials that students can get if they want to do research on that topic. So I love just Googling whatever the topic is that I'm interested in and library guide. If you put that together, chances are you're probably going to find a library guide from some university, and they're going to have a ton of links to open access resources. Okay, that's the bulk of it. Good job. This is going to be really important for you as you go along and do research in historical topics. You're going to have to know how to find good primary sources. So I'm going to end this video by giving you a few final tips and thoughts. Okay, my final tip, in addition to looking through databases and looking at digital archives and searching through publications and collections of primary sources, one other thing that you should absolutely do to find primary sources is poach the notes of your secondary sources. This is one of the easiest ways to find relevant primary sources for your research. If you've already found good secondary sources, then you can quickly go to their bibliographies and their footnotes and check out what kinds of primary sources they use to make their arguments. That's usually the quickest and most efficient way to figure out what's out there and to get a start on finding those things and tracking them down. So don't forget to poach the notes of all of your secondary sources. That's going to be one of the best ways to locate primary sources for your own research. All right, that's it for this video. Good job. See you in class and keep working.